I'd now like to introduce Doug Foley. So Doug Foley is the president of Giant Goat. Doug Foley is media entrepreneur with a passion for helping entrepreneurs and small businesses to better understand how to leverage their zone of genius to create content that sells. He is the host of the Hot Podcast, The Happiness of Pursuit, the author of Breakout Blueprint, How to Find Your Passion, Take Action, and Build a Lifestyle Business. He's also a TED Talk speaker. Please join me in welcoming Doug.
Good morning, everybody. Quick audio question. Do I need to be in front of this mic? If I move, take it with me? Yeah. Okay. I tend to walk around a lot when I speak. Two really awesome things happened for me during COVID. Number one, I got to move to Virginia Beach with my family, so we spent the summer surfing. And number two, the QR code made a comeback. So if any of you, some of you may be taking notes, you can scan that. I'll throw it up at the end. It's got everything I have. There's a YouTube video that's going to be similar to the training I'm going to put up there on the whiteboard. I tend to spend more time drawing than in PowerPoint because it's how I like to learn, and hopefully that will help you. For those of you that are online, again, you'll be able to grab the YouTube version, same training, so you won't miss much there. I'm really fortunate. One of the biggest things that helped my podcast and the other podcasts we've launched be successful is I have an amazing team behind me. Nithi's actually here now taking some photos. If any of you are looking to build a successful podcast, find awesome people to do it with. It makes it a lot easier and a lot less stressful. So today I'm going to talk about the power of an authority platform. And I'm going to show you a slide, but I want you to interact with me. The moment you see this person, I want you to shout out his name. Who is this? Thank you. That's actually Kevin Costner. But that shows you the power people have when you build a brand. And what's been amazing about this, and the reason I love this as a marketer, is if you go back to the 1950s, Ogilvy created a campaign called the Marlboro Man. How many of you are familiar with the Marlboro Man? Okay, they were so good at building this campaign that they were able to figure out, we can create this persona, this person that everybody on Wall Street wants to be. And it was so awesome to see it happen again with Yellowstone. And ironically, there's lots of people moving to Montana trying to be John Dutton. And spoiler alert, if you haven't seen season 2, he gives a beat down to some of those people, which has been pretty cool. What was really awesome when they built a campaign for the Marlboro Man is they put a lot of thought into the actual journey. And when we think about journey mapping today, a lot of it's trying to figure out how do we go from physical to digital. But when they built the campaign, it was actually a physical journey. They knew that where the people lived in the suburbs, they were able to map their physical driving route, their subway path, all the way down to the little bodega right before they walked into their individual towers. And they would sequence the messaging from the billboards about the relaxation and the reverse billboard going home, the importance of having to smoke before you walked in. Now, not so friendly now, but the importance was that they mastered the journey. And when you're building out a podcast and building out your authority, there's two things I want you to take away from today. Number one, understand the importance of building an audience first. And number two, really understand your customer journey and understand that there's a fundamental sequence of how they buy, and you must master doing things in the right order. Now, I grew up a golfer. I remember I was 3 years old watching Arnold Palmer play the Shell World of Golf, and I had this fascination with him because he had these fans chasing him, like literally running down behind him. And you'll see right here, this is the first time I've been able to use a laser on a screen in a long time, which is pretty awesome. You'll see right here, he had such a loyal fan base. They had a name. They called themselves Arnie's Army. They self-identified themselves with a fan. Much like so many people are now wearing the logo of Yellowstone's on their vehicles or on their hats, their clothes. They're buying the same jackets they see. Like the cowboy hat. Be honest with you, I love Rip's cowboy hat. I just couldn't pull it off. So when you think about the platform that you're building, think about some of the people you follow and desire to get to the point where you build an audience that identifies as your fan. And as brands, when you get to the point that people are wearing your product, that's the sense that you're building a brand that people self-identify. And that's a true sign that you're building authority in your space. Now, what's really interesting when I talk about platform, Arnold Palmer had built such a big audience, he realized I now can actually create somewhere. I can create a destination for my fans to enjoy the game that I also love. So he actually built the Golf Channel. He has since sold it to NBC Universal for a lot. But he realized that if I can take this thing, I built an audience, I built a fan base, I'm now going to move them to a platform that I own. That's when he can start to monetize them. He can start to capitalize on that attention. How many of you have a brand-related blog? Okay, or a podcast or something? This is the importance we're moving into. And I know Marty talked about the importance of content, but this will be the single most important you do for the next 10 years of your company. Creating and building an own audience is the single most important thing you can do for marketing. Otherwise, you are going to constantly have to rent it. And the cost of renting an audience, meaning you're going to have to pay for the attention, is consistently going up. And with the challenges we continue to see with organic ranking and social media, you're going to have to revert back to traditional means, and that's even more expensive. So it's really important to learn the importance of building the authority platform and getting your own audience into channels like email, getting your own subscribers. The more important thing, it happened to me personally, like I run a Facebook ad agency, my Facebook ad account got deleted. So if you haven't realized the importance of email marketing, like any brand, any individual, if you're working on a rented platform and you don't build your own, you're exposed to a massive, massive risk. The other thing that really blew my mind, and why I have it up there, is the OG influencer. Arnold Palmer was actually the first person to create a marketing agency or an agency to represent athletes. He signed the first sports contract, and it was the first agency to sign it. So he was the first one with his business partner, Mark McCormick, followed by Babe Ruth, Gary Player, Jack Nicklaus. And he established the very first influencer agency. So all the celebrities is still actually founded. He was acquired a few years ago, which is now Encore. But it's still today, they hold Michael Jordan's contract, Tiger Woods, another group of celebrities. So when we talk about the authority platform, how many of you struggle with trying to figure out what you would talk about? Or have some self-doubt, like, I don't know what I would say, I don't know what our brand could tell. Every single person in this room has some skill, some value, some unique knowledge set that somebody's searching for. And that's the value of podcasts. You don't always know what's going to stick. And the one thing I will tell you, when you can transcend this journey of putting content out there and just sharing your knowledge or even sharing your experience of, I did this, this worked, you should try it, is the first step. And that eventually is what moves you to expanding your reach and becoming an authority. I'm going to walk through a framework on the whiteboard. And again, those who are online, you can grab this on YouTube. If you can't quite see it while I'm drawing it, I will throw it up on the screen when I'm done. But this framework that I developed is responsible for well over 8 figures of revenue, both for our agency as well as our clients. And I developed it almost 9 years ago. I was working with a project with TD Bank, and we were trying to figure out how to sequence how people buy mortgages. And at the time, we were pretty focused on, it was a rate sale. Everything was just a competition on rate sale. And we actually partnered with Google to understand, what are people looking for before they come into the branch? Now, these are early days, so we didn't have a lot of social media platforms to play with. And the thing that kept coming back is people were actually looking for, how much house can I afford? Or, what's the difference between a fixed and variable rate? There were a lot of questions that were indicating that they were coming into the market, but they weren't there yet. So we started to figure out and research, how can we sequence our messaging to get ahead of that? And that was the origin of it. And one of the things when it comes down to marketing, Seth Godin's probably one of the most respected marketers. Marketing is a contest for people's attention. You're constantly playing an attention game. And there's really only three ways to do that. It's either paid, owned, or earned. I'm going to apologize in advance. I don't have spell check when I write, so I promise I will spell a couple things wrong. When you look at the customer journey, there's really three major steps. You have awareness, consideration, and decision. Okay, these are kind of your fundamentals. So you're either going to pay for these three. Now, when I started to look at these, I started to go through how our brain works. And there's really three areas of our brain that come down to decision making. The first is our root brain. This is that fight or flight mechanism. So we're looking at, does this harm me? Is it going to hurt me? And for the most part in advertising, not likely, but some things will put you off. Like you're like, I want nothing to do that. The interesting thing about our brains is, as much as we have that reptilian brain, it started to evolve and look at consequence. You know, is that something like my network would agree with? Will this cause social harm to me? The next piece was our limbic system. This is the emotional center. So as we're moving through this, we're trying to look at, you know, do I connect with this? Does this resonate with me? And I think all of us, between the dog and cat memes that get our attention, a lot of the ads that we buy into usually play on something emotional. The last piece is our neocortex. This is the decision-making or the rational center of our brain. This is when we decide, oh, I have to have that. Or Tesla's a really good example. It's green, it's good for the environment. I'll pay the premium to buy an electric car. The problem, and this is where we start to develop an actual funnel, no matter how much I pay, I can't really force the logic center to go through. And it doesn't matter how much I pay for an influencer, that decision has to be made by an individual. The problem is, as marketers, we're always taking decision-making content and using that as the first exposure. We're using decision-type ads up here in the very first thing. The very first thing, it's almost like a door-to-door salesman just walking in, sitting on your couch and asking for a check. It's really offensive. So when you start to look at this, it's really important to consider what is the actual journey that our customers need to go on. And it's not about a single ad or campaign. And one of the things I really want you to leave here with is to understand, to get away from campaign thinking. Stop thinking of the one campaign and thinking about the sequence of campaigns or content you need to follow. Now, here's the interesting thing that we really discovered. And this is where we usually can get 20 to 30% growth from every single one of our customers without spending a marketing dollar. Most businesses, if you go to a local community, have been around 10, 20, 30 years. The longer they've been around, they simply have loyalty. They have the same customers coming back again and again and again. They don't have to spend as much marketing dollars because they really live on it. And if you move into small towns, when we went to Virginia Beach, the first thing we did is ask neighbors who came over and said, hey, where do we go for these things? So before people go to search, they're more often to look for referrals. This is the first thing that they look at. So instead of having to worry about doing all the advertising over here, there's two things that customers can do. They can, one, figure out, how do I get my customers to come back more often? And number two, how do I get my customers to be the advocates for me? How many of you have a referral program or a customer loyalty program? So those are two of the single most important things you can do within your company to drive revenue without having to spend the money over here. So this is what we master first, is helping implement those programs, and then we start to go into more of your traditional marketing and sequencing the message. Any questions on that before we go further? Good, okay. So for those of you online, that's the diagram there. Again, this is in the QR code, so you can scan that, grab that as you go forward. So when it comes to rule number one, very similar marketing to what Marty was saying. So context is actually king. I gave that example right away when we talked about going in, but this is what we're all guilty of when we go in and send a decision-making ad and awareness. We're basically asking somebody to marry us right out of the gate. And quite often, that's why it's so expensive, is we just haven't earned the ability to ask for any type of sale or ask for any type of commitment. And one of the things that we see, and I'll just back up a little bit here, there's a really strong acronym here called UPSIDE. This framework came from Eugene Schwartz in a book called Breakthrough Advertising. It was written in the 1960s, probably one of the best marketing books. And this sequence is a really good framework for figuring out how do we create effective content in the right order. And you can see the acronym UPSIDE here, but it stands for unaware. So when they're coming in, do they even understand what their problem is? Do they know? And if you're the brand that introduces the problem to them or helps educate them about a potential risk they didn't know, you've done a significant amount of earning their trust. Once they move down to the problem-aware stage, that's where they start to look or understand, how do I solve this? And as a brand, you have a really good opportunity without pitching your product to help them understand, here's ways that you can fix this. During COVID, I got addicted to Go Clean Co. Probably one of the best Instagram or TikToks you can follow. She's got simple tips on how you can clean almost any mess. And I have a 6 and an 8-year-old, so my house was full of crayons, Sharpies on couches, like you name it. I found a new mess to clean up every week. But that was a good example of someone who, I didn't know that you could get Sharpie out of a couch using hand sanitizer, which there was an abundance of during COVID. There was also an abundance of Sharpie stains in our house. Now that I became problem aware, you move down to solution aware. This is where you can start introducing your products or your product set. Now, above this line right here, this unaware, problem aware, that's what they call the blue ocean. People aren't really in market. It's not competitive. They're not there. How many know what retargeting ads are? Okay. If you're creating content up here, it's really inexpensive because you can use video ads. You can use YouTube. You can use a lot more organic because it's not as competitive. As soon as you enter solution aware and people start searching for it, you are now in a pay to play game. But because you've already captured them up here, and it's easy to send them as they move down into the other spots, you now can use retargeting ads to get them into your offers. You can get them in to understand what it is. That's when your product pages can do the heavy lifting because you've earned their trust. And you followed the progression of how their brain makes decisions. You followed the logical step that customers take to making a decision. Then the last piece is just making sure that you have the right solution and the right deal for where they're at. So this is why we say context is king. Now, going back, I'm going to show you a quick ad, and then I'll give you some more commentary on it.
I strive to show people the world I grew up in. The jobs in the American West haven't changed very much over the past century. You still do the job the same way. In order to get food on the table, it involves your hands.
We're going to gather them together, we're going to push them around and put them in this round pen, and then that's that. Everybody ready? Yeah.
You're a parent to the thing you raise. You wake up in the morning, you take care of everything. You feed it, you water it, you doctor it, you teach it. You give to this way of life, and this way of life gives back to you. Every great storyteller told stories in the world that they know. I don't try to create dramatic stories or dramatic characters. I try to create real scenarios based on people who I've known or who I've imagined. And then I hold the mirror up to that world. And I believe that if I make something look real, it will be dramatic because life is dramatic.
Keep watching Yellowstone on Paramount Network, brought to you by Tractor Supply Company. Everything for life out here.
Now, one, I just generally like the show, but what's more important makes this a really effective ad is the context. It was the creator of Yellowstone. The ad was placed during Yellowstone. but it was more about the lifestyle that TSC customers live. It was a perfect example of matching context with distribution. And when you think about making successful podcasts or making successful campaigns, distribution is the single most important thing you can do after you figured out the right context, so you have the right message, the right platform, and making sure that you match those. The more you move away from making ads and focus on making good content, the higher your conversion rates, the higher your authority goes, and the more affinity people have for buying your products. TSC has skyrocketed in sales because the people who self-identify as John Duttons are going to shop there. And this ad just emphasized that identity and the connection to, I want to be like that person. And that's why when we try to focus on go away from advertising, focus on building an audience and establishing your authority, this is a really example of how effective that is. 2, done is better than perfect. How many of you have tried to launch something, but it's not good enough and it's now sitting on the back shelf or saved in your computer somewhere? Okay. I've been there. I am terribly guilty of it. How many of you know who Dude Perfect is? Okay. They made $37 million last year for making trick shots. This is not an example of something I would consider that would be worth $37 million, but this number right here tells me I'm wrong. 43,721,406,000 people have watched this video. People love content. Don't worry about being perfect, because the skill or the knowledge or the experience you have is what somebody else needs. And my favorite thing about YouTube, actually anything digital, there's a delete button. So if it's not perfect, if you don't like it, if it's not getting engagement, just delete it. The more important thing is you focus on the importance of getting your content out there, getting it in front of people, and giving them an opportunity to engage and get value from you, whether it's as a brand or whether it's an individual. Rome was not built in a day. Neither is any good content platform. You're asking a question for how long does it usually take a podcast? It's almost always around episodes 24 to 32 that it goes from your mom liking it to your market liking it. So just be cognizant and take the time to understand it takes a while. So for me, I launched my podcast in 2015. We got to episode number 100, 2018, and that was a huge tipping point. I was really fortunate to interview Tom Bilyeu. And quick side story, when the day before, it was about 2 weeks before the episode, I reached out and said, hey, I'd like to shoot the episode live. He said, sure, why don't we just do it in my studio? I was going to be in LA that week. I was beyond excited because he'd been a big mentor of mine. I was an earlier follower of his show Inside Quest before he launched Impact Theory. So the day before, I got a text from his receptionist that said, hey, come to this address on Mulholland Drive. And I started to freak out because I Google mapped it. It was like a huge mansion. I was like, well, I think she gave me his house instead of the studio. But it turns out he'd actually built a studio in his house. So I got to do episode 100 in his home, in his home studio, live on Facebook, which was also equally as terrifying. So do some things that scare you. You'll be amazed at how your audience react. A couple weeks later, I actually signed a book deal as a result of that show, which led to a TED Talk last year. None of this would have been possible had I not started filming the podcast in my basement. I had probably barely the right equipment of doing it, but just having the will to start and put yourself out there, you're going to acquire skills along the way that are going to add to the value that you end up bringing to customers. Number 4, platforms come and go, but great stories last. Again, real quick, somebody shout out, what do you think the #1 best-selling book all time is? Bingo. So when you talk about your brand, if you look at some of the publications dates, like obviously the Bible still to this day is one of the best-selling and best-read books. Harry Potter, 1997, Da Vinci Code, 2003, Think and Grow Rich, 1937. Think and Grow Rich is now a podcast, a YouTube channel, the genesis of many other business podcasts. So when you think about your positioning, think more about stories. Don't think about your brand. Remember what we talked about With the positioning of the loyalty framework, figure out how to tell good stories. And for most of, how many of you are brands in this room versus agencies? Okay, fair number. When you think of it, you have an amazing opportunity. You have customers. Like, your customers have been successful. So if you did anything, just create a podcast interviewing your customers. It's the best testimony you'll have, but you're also going to learn a ton about your product. You're going to learn things you probably didn't realize from, one, a product perspective, what your product is doing, but number two, some of the hidden traits in the language that you can use to better market your product for a referral program or just in your marketing general. So if you do nothing else, go do customer interviews. Figure out what they're doing in the marketplace. You're going to learn a ton and be more connected with them, but their story and their success is 10 times more effective than any ad program you'll ever run. So the next part, how to get started. This is probably one of my favorite quotes in life. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Much like blogging was in the late 90s, podcasts, there are tons of them. You may feel like, well, there's too many, we can't get through. There was a really good article written by Kevin Kelly, he's the founder of Wine Magazine, called 1,000 True Fans. And his thesis was that if I have 1,000 true fans, or an audience of 1,000 people, and they're loyal, anything I put into the marketplace, I'll be able to get traction, I'll be able to be successful. You don't need millions of people to follow. You don't even need thousands of people follow you. If just your customers and their close network follow you, most of you can get enough gain in your business to fund the podcast. So just understand the importance of getting started and using it as a learning exercise. If anything, you're going to learn a lot from your customers and your audience. Now, we use a really simple framework. One of the things we realized when it came to starting a podcast was it seems really overwhelming. And we tried to simplify it down. And this came from doing it for 5 years on my own and struggling through it. The simplest thing you can do is just record video. Hop on Zoom, hop on Skype, record the conversation, publish the conversation to YouTube, and then create a blog post. And the framework is really simple. On a blog post, especially if you're using WordPress, put your YouTube video, put a summary of the content, and put the transcript. That's it. If you just do that, you are further ahead than most people in terms of building a content or authority platform. From there, you can decide whether or not you want to actually create a podcast and push it out to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. But starting here is probably the simplest way to get the traction and get your awareness out. And one of the things that's been really interesting for us, we probably had our first $1 billion client come through in the last month from our podcast. We started a podcast called The GOAT Marketing Show. And there's a lot of silent watchers. Like, there's tons of people, especially LinkedIn. Like, if you're not producing video on LinkedIn, that is the best place to start, because there's so many silent observers who watch your content but don't say anything. And we got a lead 2 weeks ago from a new client. It's a $1 billion client, but we otherwise would have no way to interact with them. They had been watching for a year. Said, hey, we've watched all of these videos and now we're ready. And Marty gave that stat, 95% are not in market. A content or an authority platform keeps you in front of them the whole time. So when they're ready, they'll reach out. It's a really way. One little simple tip, and this is probably the most often missed. When you produce content, pay attention to the comments. The number of leads we pick up from comments on content, even not our own, so you can go on someone else's content and do this, but it works better if it's your own. Just reply. Hey, thanks for commenting. Here's the answer to your question. Then go to their DMs and say, hey, I noticed you asked this question. I just want to make sure it was answered for you. That like small degree of follow-up goes a really long way, because the next time you create video, they tend to pay more attention or they share it. Like, just be human, engage with people. That is it as promised. There's the QR code again for you. Any questions?
Your listeners, what's your favorite way of surveying your podcast listeners to find out what they want you to change in the podcast or what they want to see in the future?
We ask. Like, that's what I was getting to with the comments. So We tend to look at titles, like we go through a fair amount of SEO and optimize titles. We look through engagement, go back through past episodes, look at content tags to pick up themes. But more often than not, it's asking and engaging, like in the comment section. You get a fair amount of DMs on Instagram from snippets of the podcast. We use Headliner. It's a really awesome app that makes it easy to take the audio segments and publish them to social posts. You can grab it on your phone. So if you have a podcast, that makes it really simple to create either stories or posts. That's where we probably get the most feedback, is on Instagram, and people think, oh, I love that quote, and then just ask, what else do you want to hear? Instagram stories and putting a poll, LinkedIn polls have worked as well. And just ask. One of the first steps when we're working with a client and helping develop a podcast is just going through a list of frequently asked questions. And we're actually doing it right now with another brand client, and we're working with their sales team and asking, like, what questions are you getting in the field that we can create content for? And you just reverse engineer it, and then you just place it using the Upside framework. We just sequence the content. What order do we need to place the content? And most of you, being that you're an ag, you're pretty seasonal. So you'll start to pick up seasonal trends in terms of timing and figuring out, okay, when do we need to have specific episodes in market because that content's relevant to where they are in the journey. From a timing perspective, whenever that date is, move it up 2 weeks, just so you have some lag time with how people engage. And you just watch the listenership, watch the duration that they're going through.
You mentioned that you create your content on YouTube. Like, that's one of the recommendations you had. Do you find that recording or filming your podcasts and putting them as video performs better than just audio?
10 times better.
Okay.
And mainly strictly going back to distribution. With podcast, I'm limited to distribution of where people listen to audio. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Video, we can cut it up into more assets. And the challenge is, I'm hoping that I have the privilege of being on someone's commute with just a podcast. But with the video format, I can put it into LinkedIn. I can put snippets on Instagram. I can be in more places. And it tends to be a better match for B2B content. And we also knew some of the things that we talk about on the Goat Marketing Show, which is almost all video, we need to be able to show certain things. And that doesn't have the same experience in audio. My podcast, The Happiness of Pursuit, I'm interviewing people. So the medium didn't matter as much. It just gave me more assets to promote the show. So really need to figure out what is the context that best delivers the message to my audience. So if you're teaching something, showing something, it's more helpful to show it video as a necessity. If it's more interview format, more passive, then you could go more audio. But I will tell you, having video assets, greatest promotion tool you can have. You're welcome. Any questions online? Perfect.
So I know that algorithmically inserted podcast ads are becoming a thing. Are you aware of any platforms that, if a podcast is looking to advertise on other podcasts, like ones to look for or work with, or how to get involved in that space?
So I'm very biased against advertising, which is ironic being an agency. I would rather see a brand specifically partner with a content producer and create native content. I'll give you an example. Shark Farmer is a really good friend of mine. He was at my wedding. They actually do dedicated sequence where they talk about the brand story. They talk about your origin. They talk about like you as a company, not the products. And the problem is people tend to tune out, going back to like they're in this mind of entertainment or learning. When you insert an ad in this product focus, it's out of sequence. Whereas if you can be specific with a content creator and go direct as opposed to the ad route, one, it's going to be a lot cheaper for you. But two, you can be really specific about who you're saying and get a better message. So getting someone who knows how to tell a story, to tell your story or pull your story out, you have a lot better return. Tim Ferriss, great example of that. Tom Bayou, Impact Theory. when the creators create their own ads, they perform way better than trying to use an ad platform. There are a number of ad platforms, but we tend to advise against them for those reasons.